Okay, so today I wanted to walk through how to deal with the 25 marker in paper three. A few things about paper three before I kind of go into the nitty gritty. First and foremost, I actually think in terms of the content for the 25 marker, it's probably the easiest of the three papers, in my opinion. However, it is also the most time pressured exam by miles. You've got to be really good at your exam technique, particularly for the 5, 8, and 12. But anyways, this video is specifically about the 25 marker. But firstly, I just want to dispel a couple of myths. So in the 25 marker and only the 25 marker, are you expected to bring in both micro and macro? But it's important to separate. And I want you to recognize that I want one detailed analysis just on micro. Of course, you can incorporate macro into it. That's okay, as long as your overarching point is micro. And the same with macro. There's a lot of macro that is built on microeconomic principles. That's okay, as long as the overarching point is macro and the focus is predominantly macro. Now, the common misconception is that you must evaluate micro with micro and you must evaluate macro with macro. That is not true. In 90% of cases, if not more, it makes sense to evaluate micro with micro, but you don't have to. The most important thing that you have to do is that you've got to dedicate a detailed paragraph on micro and detailed analysis on macro. All right. As always, as you guys know, I think the best way to understand this is through an example. Now, the example that we're going to do is June 2018, paper three. So I'm going to really show my screen and show you guys. One more thing, actually, very important about the 25 marker in paper three. The 25 marker in paper three, unlike papers one and two, the data is relevant to the 25 marker. You are therefore expected to incorporate the data into your answer for the 25. Whereas in paper one and two is your own real world knowledge. Paper three, the data is relevant to you. So here we go. June 2018 has Edexcel's favorite thing, coffee. They love coffee. They ask about it all the time. Lock specimen paper, this paper, June 2022, paper one. Anyways, right. So let's have a look at the 25 marker. And I also think there's a correct and incorrect choice when it comes to the 25 marker. So our options are as follows. Evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic factors that may influence Starbucks' decision whether to expand in a particular country. That's the first option. Or, with reference to the information provided and your own knowledge, evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of increased UK demand for coffee at branded coffee shops. Okay, right. First things first. Normally, you get either a factor question or an effect or impact question. I honestly think that impacts and effects, is significantly easier to navigate than factors. So if I had that choice, I would almost always choose effects rather than factors. Now, you might be unlucky enough that it's two factor questions. I'll do a separate video on factors another time. But for now, let's just deal with this question. So the question we're doing is E. With reference to the information provided and your own knowledge, evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of increased UK demand for coffee at branded coffee shops. Okay, right. I know obviously we need to use the data. I've read the data. You guys can read the data as well later and kind of incorporate it into it. But let's just go through the technique. So I need you guys to understand that the most important thing to smash the 25 marker on the micro side is I want you to be drawing a cost and revenue diagram. Because if you can draw a cost and revenue diagram and things are shifting, it will give you so much depth in terms of what you can say. Now, this is a fairly straightforward question because it tells us demand is increasing. So what is demand on the cost and revenue diagram? Well, it is obviously AR and MR shifting outwards, yeah? So let's draw that to start off with. And I want to show you how many points we can draw out just from that one diagram. So let's do our systematic approach as always. We've got quantity over here, cost/revenue over here. Right, step one, as you should know, is marginal cost, MC. And now because I know I'm going to shift out AR and MR, I'm not going to start too high up on the Y-axis. I'm going to start somewhere over here. And that's going to be AR1 equals D1. And this is going to be MR1. That's MR1. Right, profit maximization occurs where MC equals MR. We're here. The price, therefore, is up here. P1. All right, and let's draw them making supernormal profit. So we got from the quantity Q1 to hit the AC curve, as you should know, D1. And remember, especially when there's shifts in the diagram, label the corners of the areas with letters. So we're going to do that as A and that as B. Okay? So the initial supernormal profits being made by, let's say this is Costa, is P1, ABC1. Okay. The demand is increasing. It's as simple as that. There's more demand for coffee. So we're going to start at a higher point on the y-axis and just shift it parallel. So we're going to do this is AR2 equals D2. And this is going to be MR2, something like that. Okay, profit maximization occurs where MC equals MR, so we're back here now. This is Q2. So the output's clearly gone up. We go all the way up to the new demand curve to get the new price. So the price, of course, goes up, P2. And finally, go up from the quantity, Q2, to hit the AC curve. Now I drew my AC curve in a very particular way to ensure that my costs went down. Yeah. And I'll explain why I did that in a second. Lastly, the corners of the areas. So I'm going to label that as D and that as E. So in other words, the profits have gone up from P1, ABC1 to P2, DEC2. All right, cool. Let's chat. What is really important for you guys to understand is the cost and revenue diagram gives you significantly more depth than a standard supply and demand diagram. I have multiple things that I can now incorporate into my answer. My overarching point, by the way, would be something like this. So the topic sentence would be, one microeconomic effect of an increase in demand for coffee is higher profits for brands such as Costa. Cool. That is my overarching topic sentence, yeah? Now, what I now want to do is, as quickly as possible, use the data to show the number of people that are buying coffee has gone up, and now say, okay, AR and MR will shift out, draw this, and summarize the key things in the diagram. The price of coffee is likely to rise from P1 to P2. Sales are likely to increase from Q1 to Q2. Now, before I talk about profitability, costs have gone down from C1 to C2. Why did they go down? Well, they went down, and if you got this right, well done. They go down because this firm, Costa, are better placed now to tap into larger economies of scale. And that opens up a whole extra chain of reasoning just for you. So what you would say is that because they're a bigger firm, they can now tap into purchasing economies of scale. For example, they can bulk buy their coffee beans in even larger quantity than they currently are. They can bulk buy the disposable cups that they use for their coffee, the milk, the sugar, anything like that, right? These are clear examples of purchasing economies of scale that I want you to now throw in to get some application of your own knowledge as well. You can bring in your own knowledge as well. And obviously there's data as well. But the point is that we can now say stuff like that. And we're not done yet. We can continue to show off by saying, oh, and by tapping into these economies of scale, they will be operating closer to, what's that point called? Well, the bottom of the AC curve is called the MES. So we're going to say, oh, they're operating closer to the MES. If they're operating closer to the MES, they become more what? Well, hopefully you're telling me that they become more productively efficient, right? So I can now show off that I know that productive efficiency is at the bottom of the AC curve, right? That all stemmed from this very basic diagram where AR and MR shifted outwards. And then, and only then, do we now bring in profitability. Well, what happens profitability-wise? Obviously, it goes up. But even then, you're not done. Because whenever you talk about profits rising, I want you to now tell me what they could do with the extra profits. So, for example, they could invest it into producing a wider range of coffee, maybe improving the quality of their coffee, maybe seasonal menus like, Christmas and things like that. Whatever. Give me an example. There's data to support it, even better. Even if there isn't, no problem. Make up examples of what they could do and now wrap it up by saying, and therefore, dynamic efficiency is likely to rise. Now, bear in mind, by the way, this is a very basic concept. It's just demand shifting outwards. And from that very basic thing, we have taken it and easily gone and done about 9, 10 chains of reasoning comfortably. Yeah. And that is the level of depth I need in the 25 marker. And it all stemmed from this diagram. This is why I need you guys to be really comfortable with these diagrams and be able to incorporate them into your answer for a 25 marker on paper 3. Right. That's our analysis. Let's evaluate. Now, there are 2 really good evaluations. Obviously, only do one of them. But one of them is a clue. And I want you to get in the habit of recognizing that there are clues in questions that they've already asked. I'm going to quickly show you the extract or the questions. It's not too obvious, but it is there. If we look at the 8 marker, it says examine the advantages of using an indirect tax as a means of reducing the use of disposable coffee cups. Any ideas what I'm getting at? Well, if you read the data, by the way, there's a reason why they tax things. They tax demerit goods. They tax things that are basically overproduced by the market or overconsumed by the market. And so what's the problem? Well, the problem is this, is it basically says 2.5 billion disposable cups are thrown away every year in the UK. That is 7 million every day. What topic is this? Well, hopefully you recognize that this is externalities. And therefore, that is a great eval. To basically say that whilst profitability for these firms increases, and that's great for them, it's really bad for the environment. They gave you the clue in the extract. And often they do this where other questions that you've already answered up to that point will be hints as to what points you can now make. Yeah? So let's quickly deal with that. What we basically will say is, okay, however, a significant problem with an increase in the consumption of coffee is it may lead to market failure or an increase in market failure, I guess. Yeah? You now basically draw. So a lot of you, I understand why your teachers may have taught you negative consumption as well as production externalities, positive. Edexcel only require you to know 2 diagrams when it comes to externalities, as silly as that might be. Negative is always going to be production, and positive is always consumption. I know that may not make a lot of sense, but just accept it as it is and draw that. So We're going to draw a negative externality from an Edexcel perspective, and it will look like this. So we're going to go, okay, I've got quantity over here, cost slash benefits on the y-axis. All right, the way I do it is I kind of go through a systematic approach where I step one, go to myself, okay, is it a negative or positive externality? Clearly negative. Is that to do with costs or benefits? Well, negative, the word, is to do with costs. So we're going to do two cost curves, which are upward sloping, and they're going to be slightly pivoted. Not a massive deal if you don't draw them pivoted, by the way. They can also be parallel, not a problem. And then finally, if there's two upward sloping lines that follows, there must be one downward sloping line, yeah? And that downward sloping line, I can label that immediately. It's going to be marginal private benefit is equal to marginal social benefit. Okay, there are 2 points of intersection. So can you see it intersects over here and it intersects over here? All right. A negative externality, is that where we're doing too little of something or too much of something? Well, negative is always where you're doing too much of a bad thing, whereas positive is where you do too little of a good thing. Still bad then, by the way, yeah? So obviously of the two options, we've got one over here and two over there. Which one represents doing too much? Logically, obviously the second one, so this must be equilibrium. It's QE, I label that as social optimum, SO, PSO, and that is PE. Yeah? Okay, if I put my pen on the equilibrium, because I know that it is 100% the equilibrium always occurs where private cost equals private benefit in any externality. Private cost is supply, private benefit is demand. So if that line going through it has not been labeled yet, it must be private. It's MPC, this therefore is MSC. The very final thing I do is I get the welfare loss triangle by putting my pen on the equilibrium and drawing a straight line up, like that, okay? Right, all we have to do, and bear in mind, the evaluation does not need the same level of depth as the analysis. So we're basically explaining the diagram and saying, oh, if more people consume coffee, there's likely to be a bigger welfare loss. I could, by the way, technically shift out the demand curve here. Don't really want you to be honest with you, like just leave this as it is. There's no need to make it more complex than it is. And explain kind of the welfare loss that arises from people throwing away their cups, the environmental impact. Of course, the extract will be very helpful, but more strain on the NHS. It's going to result in toxic waste. It might be bad for like fishermen. It might result in the oceans getting depleted and destroyed, blah, blah, blah. You get the point, yeah? The point is you just simply explain why there's a market failure. Don't go overboard because you will run out of time, but be aware that that's a very solid evaluation. All right. Can I tell you the alternative evaluation, even though obviously we just need one, yeah? The alternative evaluation was in the examiner report, and I think it's a really clever eval. What they said in the examiner report, or the kid that wrote the answer in the examiner report was, think about it, the UK coffee shop market and coffee shops generally, that market is fairly contestable. The barriers to entry are pretty low. It's not that hard to set up a cafe. The evidence of that is that there are thousands of independent coffee shops, right? Therefore, when there's an increase in demand for coffee, maybe the demand is actually met by an increase in supply. In other words, you might suddenly see loads of new entrants into the market, and therefore the profits might be distributed between multiple different firms, in which case you don't get that much more profit, if at all. So we talked about profitability rising and how they're going to be a lot better off. Well, maybe not, because the barriers to entry are fairly low. You can even give the example of like Blank Street, for example, coming into the UK coffee shop market in the last couple of years and how they've started to sell more coffee. Greggs has started to sell way more coffee in areas like London, etc. The point simply, though, is that because the market's contestable, when there's an increase in demand, there may actually also be an increase in supply, in which case actually profitability may not go up that much. Is that clear? That was the alternative. I don't mind that. That works really well. I feel like this one's pretty straightforward, though, and it's got data to support it as well. Yeah? All right, we've done the micro side of things. Let's now deal with macro. So how can I make a micro concept and turn it macro? Now, on the examiner report, the answer basically talks about consumption rising. I think that is a bit far-fetched. They credited it and they're like, yeah, that's valid. But coffee is like a teeny, tiny percentage of total consumption in the UK. Like, it's a bit ridiculous to be like, oh, yeah, consumption is going up. But I think a very logical one to kind of explore. And again, by the way, you know how micro, I want you to basically do cost and revenue. Macro, most of the time, you're going to be doing ADAS. Yeah? Right, let's remind ourselves the components of AD. So AD, as we know, is C plus I plus G plus open brackets X minus M. Oh, okay. Right. Which of those components could be rising as a result of an increase in demand for coffee? Well, I personally think that you're going to get more TNCs, like coffee shops, who are based abroad, like a Starbucks, like a Cafe Nero. I don't know if you guys know Tim Hortons, for example. They're very famous and popular in Canada, etc. If more people in the UK start consuming coffee, that is their signal to come and set up in the UK. And therefore, if they come and set up in the UK and they open up their franchise, or they open up their coffee shop, several things happen. The first thing is that FDI, foreign direct investment is a component of AD. And so AD is likely to shift outwards. But investment is also an injection into the circular flow of income. And so there is likely to be a positive multiplier effect. Now, I would define it in words, but it's a 25 mark. I want to give you an example to add to it so that you've got more depth and you can easily take these chains of reasoning and develop them. So the definition will be positive multiplier effect. This is the number of times the rise in national incomes exceeds the initial injection that caused it. But let's do that with an example. If a company like Starbucks or Blank Street or Tim Hortons, whoever you know, that's a foreign company that's in the coffee market, set up in the UK, what do you guys agree? They're going to hire more baristas. They're going to hire more staff generally. Those individuals that are hired now have an income. And so what do they do with their income? Well, they spend it. Therefore, consumption in the economy goes up. As there is now more demand for goods and services, there is more demand for labor because labor is derived demand. I know that's a micro concept. No problemo. It's okay. And you can now show off by saying that if there's more demand for labor and basically more people are employed, that reduces a particular type of unemployment. That is cyclical. Unemployment will go down. The other name, by the way, for cyclical, in case that makes it easier to understand and process, is demand deficient. What does that mean? If demand is deficient, it means a lack of demand for goods leads to a lack of demand for labor. Well, the opposite is happening now. There's more demand for goods, therefore there is more demand for labor. Once I've gone through and basically fleshed that out and gone through all the, what the multiplier is, I can now draw it. And even in my diagram, we can show off. Why? Because we're going to shift the AD curve, but not once, twice. So I'm going to have real GDP over here and price level, otherwise known as inflation, over here. You should really, by the way, be drawing the LRAS curve as a Keynesian LRAS curve unless you're explicitly told to draw an SRAS curve, like, for example, like an 8 marker or something like that. Anyways, so we're going to have AD somewhere over here to begin with, AD1, initial equilibrium, D1 is AD2, but we're not done there. So that first outward shift of AD is because of the rise in foreign direct investment. But now we shift it a second time because that is the positive multiplier in action. Y3, P3. All right. Now we summarize the diagram. The key things to summarize are economic growth is rising from Y1 to Y3, which may lead to higher living standards in the UK. There is also some demand pull inflation. I don't have to mention it can, but economic growth is the main thing I want to kind of focus on. That would be my overarching point. Now, at that point, normally that's enough depth. That is actually sufficient. We've developed it in a decent number of chains of reasoning. However, on purpose, I'm going to add one more layer because this is why you plan in advance before you jump into these essays. Because you'd have read the data for the 5, 8, and 12. And one of the data sets, I will show you guys to kind of give you a clue. One of the data sets is all about Starbucks and yeah, whether they're actually a loss-making business. Yeah. So it basically explains in the data that Starbucks have paid practically no tax. Yeah, there's a process called transfer pricing where they move their profits to a country where taxes are much lower. So it looks like they're loss making in the UK. Yeah, it explains this, by the way, in very decent detail here. Yeah, this is where it says the main reason why Starbucks has reported persistent losses in the UK is not due to a lack of demand for its coffee, but to minimize its tax bill. Okay. I'm going to deal with that as evaluation, by the way. And therefore, in order for me to talk about it as evaluation, it makes more sense than after I've said economic growth has gone up, to now also say the government are going to collect more tax revenue. Because there's going to be more income tax, but most importantly, more corporation tax. These TNCs that set up, like Starbucks, are going to pay tax. And the government now can use that tax revenue to invest into education and training and increase the productive capacity of the economy. No need to draw the diagram. You've already shifted out AD twice. That's enough. That's enough depth. Yeah. I added that extra layer just so I can evaluate it. So that now I can be like, according to extract A, though, may not be making that much more profit because this is the thing is that, however, the increased foreign direct investment may not lead to extra revenue for the government, as extract A states. And then you talk about how basically there's a few quotes in here, by the way, that you could use about how they take advantage of things called transfer pricing, where they move their profits to another part of the world. Normally it's Ireland, but I think in this case it's the Netherlands. Yeah. In order for them to avoid paying taxes in the UK. So the government might not make that much more revenue. Yeah. Now that is already very good. Can I add one more kind of cherry on top? The last cherry on top to just add a bit more depth to that evaluation is to say that actually, even if there's an increase in demand for coffee in the UK, because the UK decided to leave the EU, and because of the fact that we no longer have free trade with the EU, as of today anyway, that might deter them from setting up. They might be reluctant to actually set up in the UK, even with the increased demand for coffee, they may not find it worthwhile setting up because importing the coffee beans might be expensive now. It might be that, they wanted to basically set up and sell their products and services across the EU, like as in, and obviously not hot coffee, but like for example, instant coffee and stuff like that Starbucks also sell. Anyways, the point is that Brexit may deter TNCs from setting up. They may not want to set up in the UK. Easy. That is it. And all you need to do now in the judgment is basically something like, I mean, the judgment, by the way, as long as you're making some concerted effort at actually like having some sort of balanced opinion about the whole thing, don't say I will, by the way. They're not like that. So it'll be something like on the balance of evidence, the microeconomic impact of an increase in demand for coffee is likely to be more prevalent than the macroeconomic effect. Yeah, like as in you think about it. On a micro level, yeah, like big time profitability could be rising. On a macro level, like this is not a massive market in the grand scheme of things. Like the coffee shop market is not going to account for like, it'll be less than 0.5% of the UK's GDP, probably even less than that, but significantly less than that. Yeah. So, anyways, you basically say that on a macro basis, the coffee shop market is not large enough to have a significant impact on aggregate demand. However, on a micro basis, it may result in new entrants entering the market, but it also could lead to big, market failure. So the government should monitor this and incentivize individuals to turn to recycling schemes to limit the extent of the market failure. Something like that, which is basically the policy advice to the government to be like, okay, people are buying more coffee. That's going to be bad for the environment. Watch out. Basically, deal with it. Yeah. Right. The main thing I wanted to get across in this video, though, was to ensure that you understood the technique in terms of what I need you guys to do for the 25 mark for paper 3. And yeah, hopefully that was helpful.